Hi, and welcome back to the channel, Biblical Mysteries. My name is Dr. Rich Sorensen, and I'm your host for this channel. And in this video series, we're discussing the ancient aliens. And as we proceed with this topic, I'll be referring to many resources that you may want to check out for yourself. This video is based on papers I have written, which footnote all the references, so there are links to the papers in the description box. Now, this video series is nominally about the ancient aliens, but the real object of this study are the most significant events in the history of the world and how they fit into an overall picture of which the ancient aliens are a part. We are connecting dots from the beginning of humanity on this planet all the way to the end, so that we have an overarching view of all of history. Now, it may be a surprise and a shock to some, but the most significant events of human history occurred before the development of writing. And the only true sources for learning about this essential history is the Bible. And these events include the following. Number 1, pre-creation, the origin of angels, and the fall of some angels into becoming demons. Number 2, creation and the origin of all species on the planet Earth. Number 3, the perfection of the Garden of Eden and the subsequent fall of people into sin and the consequences. Number 4, the arrival of the demonic sons of God and their impact upon the ancient world, creating patterns of evil, injustice, and rule that would be repeated throughout history. Number 5, the Great Flood, which was a judgment of God upon the world of that day, in which the ecosystem of our planet was altered to the seasons and the landscape of our current experience, and society was rebuilt, starting with Noah and his children. And number 6, the Tower of Babel, which represented the development of power politics and the attempt to create a one-world government. In effect, the one ring to rule them all. And that is the subject of our current video. Now, the Bible tells us that after Noah and his family came out of the ark, they moved out of the mountains and down into the valleys below. Children were born, society began to grow, and people began to spread out. Now, the migration patterns are not clearly known, but many apparently stayed on or near the plains of Shinar, which was where Noah and his family first settled. And there were only 8 survivors from the flood, so the world was repopulated from the sons of Noah, who were Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives. Shem was the father of the Semitic peoples, the Arabs, Akkadians, Babylonians, Canaanites, Hebrews, and Syrians. Ham was the father of the Hamitic peoples, Egyptians, Libyans, Nubians, and Africans. And Japheth was the father of the Europeans, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Asians. And the genealogy of Noah's descendants is given in Genesis chapter 10, along with details on their geography, language, and tribal identity. Now, Noah and his family moved to the plains of Shinar and started farming. And there's been much scholarly debate on the location of Shinar, where it was, and how large an area it was, with some proposing that it was located in northern Mesopotamia, in other words, in southern Turkey or Syria, nearer to the mountains of Ararat. The ancient sites of Göbekli Tepe, Urfa, and Haran all lie to the immediate south of Ararat, and could possibly have been the location where Noah and his sons originally settled. However, most scholars feel that the plains of Shinar were further south, somewhere within the area known as Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers. In other words, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this area is located primarily in the country known today as Iraq, with its northern region in Syria, as shown in the map below. Now, this region may very well have been the site for the biblical Garden of Eden, the location of which is described as follows. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. And the name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Myrrh and onyx stones are there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Now, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are well known. And the Gihon is probably the Karun River, which originates in the Zagros Mountains of Iran and joins the other two rivers before emptying into the Persian Gulf. Joel Kramer, the archaeologist, has discovered what was probably the Pishon River. It is now called the Wadi Ruma, and it is a dry riverbed that runs from the Hijaz Mountains on the eastern side of Saudi Arabia all across the Arabian Peninsula to join the other rivers. And interestingly, the riverbed surrounds the largest gold mine in Saudi Arabia, and the area was mined in ancient times all the way down to the present. This is mentioned in the above text from Genesis as the Land of Havilah. And the area is also known for the presence of onyx and other semi-precious stones. Saudi Arabia was also one of the main sources for myrrh, which was a very significant and costly spice in the ancient world. The area north of the Persian Gulf, where the rivers join, was known as Sealand. And it is to the east of Israel, as indicated in the Genesis text, and it is a tropical and well-watered area, so it's an excellent candidate for the Garden of Eden. Genesis chapter 4 indicates that after the murder of Abel, Cain traveled to the east and built a city named Enoch for his son. And that town or region may have later have been known as Erech or Uruk. The first true cities and larger population areas were in southern Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf in the Sealand region, Eridu, and later Uruk and Ur. They were the civilization of Sumer. Now, the word Shinar is probably related to Sumer, which, of course, as I just stated, was the first civilization in the world, and it was located in southern Mesopotamia. And that may have been also where the Garden of Eden was located, as we've discussed. Noah was probably aware of this location and wanted to settle in the area where he grew up and previously lived, which would explain the long journey south of around 600 miles from the Ararat region. Genesis chapter 11 states that Noah's family and descendants journeyed from the east, so they may have moved south along the Tigris River and then west into what is referred to as the Land of Shinar and Sumer. And aside from being Noah's ancestral home, the Sumer Shinar Sealand area made economic sense for a number of reasons. Number one, water from the rivers was readily available. Number two, fertility of the soil for growing crops. Noah began to be a farmer and he planted a vineyard, according to Genesis chapter 9. And the watered areas of southern Mesopotamia support a variety of grains, wheat and barley, as well as fruits such as grapes, pomegranates, and dates. Number three, fish would have been available from the rivers, and wildlife there were plentiful for hunting. And finally, number four, the soil provided building material. Mud brick was used extensively for construction. Now, as previously mentioned, there are a large number of flood stories from around the world, and Noah has different names in some of these stories. For example, one of Noah's names is Shurupak, which is also the name of a town located in the middle of Sumer, named after him, and where it was said that he and his family settled. The Instructions of Shurupak was a document of wisdom literature and was one of the oldest writings of its kind ever discovered. And it was possibly written by Noah, who was named in the Sumerian king list as Shurupak or Ziasundra, or by his father Methuselah, who was named as Ubaru-Tutu. Now, Ubaru-Tutu or Methuselah is recorded in most extant copies of the Sumerian king list as being the final king of Sumer prior to the flood, and he is briefly mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where he is identified as the father of Utnapishtim, which was the Akkadian name for Noah. And according to the epic, Utnapishtim was the man instructed by God to build a boat in order to survive the flood. And the Instructions of Shurupak text consists of advice regarding piety, virtue, and community standards. And considering the conflict that arose in Noah's family that we'll discuss below, it may have been written by Noah to his sons. Now, the word language comes from the word tongue and was originally only spoken. Written language came later after the events that we will describe below. And there is general agreement among philologists that the Near East was the cradle of language. Genesis chapter 11 states that, quote, the whole earth used the same language. So there was only one original language that everyone used. Now, that statement is, of course, a generalization of the situation, and does not mean that every person then alive on the entire planet spoke exactly the same language, as there may very well have been dialects. But this common language has been described as Proto-Indo-European, and may well have been based on or had elements of an ancient version of Hebrew. Now, the Hebrew language is interesting because, unlike any other language, it is inherently conceptual. The individual letters of the language are semimic. Semim means a unit of meaning. Each Hebrew letter has meaning, and the meanings of the letters form the basic unit of semantics in the language. If we compare this to English, the letters A, B, C, and so forth carry no meaning in themselves, and the denotation is determined only by an aggregation of the letters that have by agreement come to carry a given definition or meaning. So, for example, the letters D, O, and G in combination has come to mean the furry domestic animal that many people keep as pets. In contrast, the individual letters of the Hebrew alphabet each carry meaning within the letter itself. For example, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, corresponding to the English A, and it means strength or leader. The second Hebrew letter is Bet, corresponding to the English B, which means house or home. Putting the two letters together, AB or Ab, means leader of the house, and it is the Hebrew word for father. Hebrew words are a combination of 1 to 3 letter roots, each of which also have a distinct meaning. So even Hebrew names carry meanings. For example, the biblical name Abigail means my father is joy, and Abimelech means my father is king. Thus, Hebrew is possibly the most intelligent and meaningful language ever devised, and possibly was the language of Adam and Eve. And this may have been the significance of Adam giving names to the animals in Genesis chapter 2, and in using this facility of language to assign a name to each animal that was inherently meaningful and represented the essential nature of that animal. Now, most of today's languages are phonetic in their written forms, meaning that each letter has a specific sound, so that written words can be read and pronounced by knowing the sounds of the letters. And after the letter sounds are known, reading words in the language is therefore easier. Hebrew was the first language for which a phonetic alphabet was devised. The Phoenician alphabet, which was said to be the first phonetic alphabet in existence, but however, it appeared around 600 years later and was therefore derived from Hebrew rather than the opposite. And even our word alphabet comes from the first 2 letters of the Hebrew language, Aleph and Bet. In contrast, the oldest written forms of communication, both cuneiform and hieroglyphics, were scripts, where the symbols of the language denoted units of meaning rather than letters. So there's no way to directly read or sound out a script. Rather, the meaning of each symbol had to be memorized in order to be turned into the spoken language. And there were a large number of symbols to convey all of the necessary meanings, so reading and writing was limited to the higher class adepts and served to preserve ancient hierarchies. Cuneiform was the first known form of writing to be developed and was invented and popularized around the time of the Tower of Babel debacle and during the Uruk migration, as we'll describe below. The hieroglyphics of Egypt may well have been created by individuals familiar with cuneiform, but who decided to use pictographs rather than lines and wedge-shaped formations. No other forms of written communication predating the Uruk migration have ever been found, so prior to that time, it seems that language was only spoken. With no forms of writing available to record events, ancient peoples therefore put a much higher premium on memorization and oral history than we do. After the Tower of Babel, when people started speaking different languages, there was now a much more pressing need to have a written form of communication in order to facilitate trade and record economic transactions. The Hebrew alphabet was developed around 1840 BC, during the time when the biblical Joseph was vizier of Egypt. And versions of this writing were discovered in the early 20th century by the archaeologist Flinders Petrie, carved on walls in turquoise mines located in the Sinai Peninsula, where the Hebrews had carried out mining expeditions on behalf of the Egyptians. The Hebrew language has 22 letters in its alphabet, and all of them are consonants, with the vowels being implied. And the pictograph for each letter was originally similar to various Egyptian hieroglyphics. This scheme was probably devised by Joseph and or by his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. The sons were adopted by Joseph's father Jacob and came to live with their uncles' families, so they well could have used the alphabet that had been devised to record the stories of their ancestors on papyrus in Hebrew. And what was recorded could then be passed down to Moses, who lived several hundred years later when he wrote the Torah, again using an ancient version of the Hebrew alphabet. And over the centuries, the Hebrew letters were gradually modified and stylized so that they became easier to write quickly. But the ancient versions were essentially pictographic, with each picture representing the meaning of the corresponding letter. For example, the letter Aleph was originally written in the shape of a bull's head with horns. So both the meaning of the letter as well as its written symbol meant strength or leader. The letter Bet was written in the shape of a house, which also corresponds to its meaning, and so on. Language is speech, so when the written version of a language easily corresponds to the spoken version, it becomes much easier for ordinary people to read, and it thus greatly enlarges the number of literate individuals and societies using that language. And this may well account for the Jewish emphasis on and the respect for the written word. Hebrew writing is also self-parsing. There was no punctuation symbols, and the first versions did not even have any spaces between the letters. Vowels were implied and were not designated until the Masoretes added vowel points to written Hebrew in the 9th century AD. So documents as well as copies of documents could be completed more quickly than in other languages. Now, before considering the direction of society, it's important to review an event which took place soon after Noah and his family left the ark. Genesis tells a curious story of domestic conflict, which, like the fall of Adam and Eve, was instrumental in setting the tone and the direction of ancient history. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away. And when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Now the term "saw the nakedness of his father" is a euphemism for some type of incestuous sexual act. And the Bible uses this euphemism for incest in other places, such as repeatedly in Leviticus and Ezekiel. Thus there was more involved than merely seeing. And further evidence for this is a statement that, quote, "When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him." In other words, this involved action and not just viewing. Therefore, it seems likely that the act was either homosexual and performed on Noah, or heterosexual and performed on Noah's wife. And in the lead-up to this event, Genesis specifically states that Canaan was the son of Ham, implying that Canaan was a party to what happened. But the real evidence is that Noah specifically cursed Canaan, not Ham, and indicated that Canaan would be subordinate to both Shem and Japheth. So it seems that Canaan was the guilty party, with Ham, his father, watching or perhaps encouraging the entire scene, and not stopping his son or rebuking him. And the above text states that it was Noah's youngest son who did whatever was done to him. Ham is always listed as the second of the three sons, so either he was actually the third son, or most likely Noah was referring to his grandson Canaan, who at that point may well have been his youngest offspring. It therefore seems that Canaan was involved in debased sexual practices, and if so, he showed no respect either for his grandparents, for social norms, or for the laws of God. He also seemed to be very selfish, sexually obsessed, and had little regard for his own safety and future. After all, sexually abusing the head of the clan or his wife by a grandson was an act of both audacity and stupidity. Now, given the limited details we have on Canaan's life, it's hard to make a firm judgment, but it's possible that Canaan had Nephilim elements in his genetic makeup from his mother and passed them on to his progeny. In a previous episode, we discussed the possible connection between the Nephilim, psychopathic behavior, and the genetic payload that they inherited from the demonic sons of God. Therefore, it's no surprise that Canaan's descendants, in other words, the tribes who lived in the name that came to be named after him, were the most sexually debauched people of the ancient world. Therefore, Canaan was probably the ancestor of the Anakim and other large and violent peoples that the Israelites encountered in the days of Moses and Joshua. Goliath of Gath, the man who opposed David in the famous biblical story, was said to be 6 cubits and a span in height, which was approximately 9.5 feet tall. And he may have also been a descendant of Canaan, and therefore may have been genetically Nephilim. The Bible also speaks of other huge men from Gath, with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Now, the Bible doesn't provide any more detail in Noah's story, but this event seems to have caused a family split, with Ham and his descendants going their own way. Ham's other sons were Put, who founded Libya, Mizraim, who founded Egypt, and Cush, who founded Ethiopia, and also possibly Persia. Cush, in turn, had a son named Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior, and who returned to Sumer and conquered the land of his great-grandfather Noah through force of arms. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went on to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. Now, historians have never been able to place the biblical Nimrod into the history of Mesopotamia. But many believe that the name Nimrod, which actually means rebellious one, was a description of his character or an epithet rather than his actual name. He is referred to in the text we just read as, quote, a mighty hunter, but probably a better translation would be a mighty slaughterer or tyrant. His family bore a grudge against Noah, and Nimrod formed what was probably the first army in the history of the world and became the first conqueror of the history of in the history of the world. And in the opinion of the author, Nimrod's real name was, or later became, Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh was one of the rulers in the Sumerian king list, and whose exploits were told and embroidered in the Gilgamesh epic. The epic describes Gilgamesh as very large, aggressive, sexually obsessed, and semi-divine, possibly having a Nephilim bloodline, like Canaan. Second Temple writings, as well as the Talmud and Arab sources, including the Quran, have a lot to say about Nimrod, and allege that he was the builder of the Tower of Babel. So here's a few examples. And when Nimrod had joyfully returned from battle, after having conquered his enemies, they placed the regal crown upon his head, and he set over his subjects princes, judges, and rulers, as is the custom among kings. And all the princes of Nimrod and his great men took counsel together, and they went to seek an extensive piece of ground to build the city and the tower. And they sought in the whole earth, and they found none like one valley at the east of the land of Shinar, about 2 days' walk. And they journeyed there, and dwelt there, and they began to make bricks, and burn fires to build the city and the tower that they had imagined to build. And in the 7th year of Ru, the building of the great tower in the land of Shinar began. And Nimrod, the son of Cush, fed the builders of on the beasts which he had hunted. And 40 years after the tower was finished, God sent a wind, and the tower was overturned, and Nimrod died in it. It was he who, after the flood, reigned in Babel. Now, prior to Nimrod arriving on the scene, there was no record in the Bible of war, takeover, or large-scale hostility. Therefore, Nimrod's cruelty and conquest may well have set the general Mesopotamian tone for the behavior of later leaders and armies. For example, the Assyrians engaged in mass executions and depicted the torture of their enemies in great detail on the walls of their palaces. They cut off limbs, gouged out eyes, flayed people, and impaled them on large stakes, leaving them to die a slow and extremely painful death. Such sights were a showcase of their power, instilling fear and terror into the rest of the population, which resulted in a cultural milieu of coarseness, cruelty, and violence. Now, Noah had placed a generational curse on Canaan, and as Nimrod was Canaan's nephew, so Nimrod may well have hated Noah and everything to do with his great-grandfather. Therefore, when Nimrod came to power and conquered the land of Sumer, he created a priesthood in defiance of Jehovah. So, inspired by demons, they invented gods such as Marduk and Ishtar, and they required the peoples of Sumer to worship these gods. Ancient kings often claimed divinity, and as king of Sumer, Nimrod or Gilgamesh may have pronounced himself as a god. Now, regardless of whether Nimrod was Gilgamesh and whether the Tower of Babel was constructed under his aegis, Nimrod was a prototypical of many rulers and dictators of later history who came to power through force and then sought to deify themselves in various ways in order to justify their authority in the minds of the people. Now, the next topic that Genesis turns to after the flood was the conflict in Noah's family is the building of the Tower of Babel. And depending upon the date range used, that event took place 200 or more years after the flood, and it's described as follows. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the whole face of the earth." Now, the first part of the above text may refer to Noah and his sons settling in Shuruppak, and then later generations deciding to build the tower. Like the flood of Noah, there are many versions of the Tower of Babel story from cultures around the world, including Egyptian, Phoenician, Armenian, Irish Celtic, Russian, and many others. And it should be noted that the Tower of Babel site was not necessarily known as Babel prior to this incident taking place. The name may very well mean confused speech or babbling. So using the term Babel for the location may therefore have been an epithet or a description of what happened that came into use afterwards, rather than the original name of the place. Only later was that term or derivative terms applied to cities in Mesopotamia, such as Babylon. Therefore, there are at least 7 locations in Mesopotamia that are named Babel, so the Tower of Babel site is still not settled. For possible locations, see the article, "The Real Reason for the Tower of Babel." Now, the phrase, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven," does not mean that the builders expected their tower to be tall enough to actually reach heaven. It probably was not even high enough to reach the clouds. Having experienced the flood a few generations previously, the leaders may have wanted to build upward, but it's more likely that the tower was intended to reach heaven for religious purposes, as a symbol of the power and the potential divinity of the leader who wanted to become God and take on the power of heaven and construct a monument to the gods for which he himself was the representation or avatar. And this fits well with the dictatorial nature of kingship and the gods in that day. And there are individuals in all societies who crave power over others. And if they are clever and ruthless enough, they will tend to rise to the top. And the average person who goes to work, pays taxes, and raises his kids has little conception of the passion that those at the top of society have for power and the overweening desire to rule over and control others. And it seems that Nimrod, or the early rulers of Sumer, had that extreme passion and were on their way to achieving a one-world government, by which they would then control everyone for their own benefit. So, God in his mercy prevented that from happening by confusing people's language and launching what became known later as the Uruk Expansion. And by so doing, God created nations and ethnicities so that people would spread out across the entire world and power would be diffused rather than being concentrated in one city. There have been numerous attempts to achieve worldwide power, but none has as yet succeeded. Now, in our day, we see continual efforts to enlarge and socialize government, such as the European Union. It's therefore incumbent on us to resist the growth of government in order to prevent it from becoming a monster, as it could have very well been in ancient Sumer. The consequence for the general population was not a judgment, as in the case of the flood. No one was hurt except possibly Nimrod and or the leaders who planned the Tower of Babel as a monument to their self-professed divinity. And the book of Revelation speaks of the future rise of a one-world government, led by a dictator who is referred to as the Antichrist and the Beast. And he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free men and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, this government of Revelation is called Babylon the Great, and the associated religious system is referred to as Mystery Babylon. So it may be, or may not be, situated in the actual city of Babylon in Iraq. This city was partially rebuilt by Saddam Hussein during the period of 1979 to 2003, and perhaps was the original location of the Tower of Babel. But regardless of the physical location, this future government will be a replay of the human craving for absolute power that was thwarted by God in Nimrod's era, but allowed to take place at the end of days. Now, the Bible indicates that a large migration took place at this time. So the Lord God scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now this migration seems to match the Uruk Expansion, which took place around 2950 BC, in which peoples left southern Mesopotamia in all directions. The city of Uruk was populated at the same time that Eridu was being abandoned, making Eridu a likely site for the Tower of Babel. And it's also here that the first evidence of writing has been found in the form of early cuneiform text. This all makes sense because when spoken languages were changed, forms of writing became necessary, as we mentioned above, in order to communicate with other groups. Now, many of the pottery and building techniques of ancient Sumer were copied and then modified by societies as they spread out, such as the ziggurat form of temple construction, which was adopted by many cultures around the world, including Egypt, Central America, the Mayan and the Inca, Thailand, and elsewhere. And the Uruk expansion also led to segregated living groups, which are a natural consequence of peoples with different languages who couldn't easily communicate with each other, and which we still see today as a preference for ethnic conclaves in urban areas. Now, this is not to say that every person in the world lived in Mesopotamia prior to the Uruk expansion and dispersion, as there is evidence of older settlements and unrelated languages elsewhere, such as the early Neolithic peoples in Egypt. But the largest group apparently remained closer to their place of origin and then left in many directions during the Uruk expansion. Now, as a result of this migration process, groups of people who spoke the same language eventually became nations, and many of those nations still exist and have evolved into their present forms. For example, the first pharaonic dynasty of Narmer dates from that time, and the long centuries of time in the BC era that followed, and that will be discussed in the next video. If you like this channel, please click on the like and share buttons. If you want to see more videos from this channel, please click on the subscribe and notify buttons. Thanks for watching.